Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly past the heavy stone walls of medieval castles and into one of the most private spaces in the royal world. The royal bedroom. Now you might imagine velvet curtains, candlelight, and elegant kings and queens discussing poetry before drifting peacefully to sleep. But medieval royal bedrooms were rarely peaceful. They were crowded, political, uncomfortable, and sometimes deeply strange places where power, fear, ambition, and human weakness all mixed together in ways that modern history books often politely avoid mentioning. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these long journeys through history. And feel free to tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, settle in, maybe let the quiet hum of a fan fill the room, and let's slowly wander into the strange and surprisingly chaotic world of medieval royal bedrooms. To understand the secrets of royal bedrooms, we first need to forget almost everything that modern movies show us. Because privacy, the thing we expect most from a bedroom, barely existed in the medieval world. A king's bedroom was not just a place for sleep. It was an office. A meeting room. Sometimes a courtroom. Occasionally even a dining hall. And yes, sometimes dozens of people were present while the king was simply trying to go to bed. Royal attendants, guards, servants, scribes, visiting nobles, and advisors constantly moved in and out of the chamber. In some courts, a king might wake up in the morning to find 20 people already waiting inside the room, quietly watching and waiting for him to begin the day. Even getting dressed could be a public event. Servants known as valets would help the king put on his clothes piece by piece while officials discussed taxes, wars, marriages, and political alliances. Imagine trying to start your day while someone is arguing about military strategy next to your bed. That was normal life for a medieval king. And when it came to royal marriages, the bedroom was not simply a private romantic moment between husband and wife. It was often a public political ritual. When a royal couple married, the wedding night was sometimes treated almost like a state ceremony. Nobles might escort the couple to their bed. Priests would bless the marriage. Witnesses might remain nearby to ensure that the marriage was officially completed. Because in medieval politics, marriage was not just about love. It was about alliances, inheritance, and producing heirs who could continue a dynasty. Without a child, a kingdom could fall into chaos. So the royal bedroom became one of the most politically important rooms in the entire castle. And sometimes, the pressure placed on royal couples inside those rooms was enormous. Take the example of King Henry VIII of England, a man whose romantic life eventually turned into one of the most dramatic stories in European history. Henry was obsessed with the idea of producing a male heir. At the time, the survival of his dynasty depended on it. But his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave birth to several children who sadly did not survive infancy, except for one daughter. Princess Mary. Henry grew increasingly frustrated and convinced himself that his marriage was cursed. Which eventually led to one of the most famous marital disputes in history. Henry wanted a divorce. The church refused. And the result was a religious and political earthquake that reshaped England forever. But long before that drama unfolded, the royal bedroom had already become a place of tension, expectation, and quiet disappointment. Royal couples were expected to perform a duty. Produce heirs. Strengthen alliances. Secure the future of the kingdom. Romance, if it appeared at all, was almost accidental. And sometimes the pressure created deeply awkward situations. For example, in several European courts. Royal physicians were occasionally asked to examine a marriage to determine whether it had been physically completed. Yes, medieval doctors were sometimes called in to investigate the private lives of kings and queens. History, it turns out, could be extremely intrusive. And things could become even stranger when superstition entered the room. Many medieval rulers believed that astrology, magic, or divine signs influenced fertility. Some kings consulted astrologers to determine the best night to attempt conception. Others surrounded their beds with religious relics, charms, or blessed objects. Because in the medieval mind, the royal bedroom was not just a physical place. It was also a battleground between fate, divine will, and human desire. And sometimes, royal relationships inside those rooms were far from peaceful. Some kings were devoted husbands. Others treated marriage as little more than a political arrangement while pursuing numerous lovers across the court. Mistresses became a common feature of royal life. And some of them gained enormous influence. A favored mistress might receive estates, jewelry, titles, and even political power. In certain courts, nobles would compete for the attention of the king's favorite companion, hoping to gain influence through her. Which meant the royal bedroom was not just a place of romance. It was also a center of political intrigue. Secrets whispered at night could change the fate of entire kingdoms. And occasionally, those secrets led to scandal. In France, England, Spain, and beyond, rumors about royal affairs spread through castles faster than official announcements. Courtiers loved gossip. And a single whispered story about a king's behavior could travel across Europe within weeks. Sometimes those rumors were exaggerated. Sometimes they were absolutely true. But either way, they became part of the strange and fascinating culture that surrounded medieval royalty. And once you start looking closely at the stories hidden behind castle doors, you quickly realize something surprising. For all their power, wealth, and ceremony, medieval kings and queens were still human. They worried. They argued. They made strange decisions. And occasionally they created scandals that historians are still trying to untangle hundreds of years later. But as we continue tonight, we'll discover that some royal bedrooms were not just awkward or political. Some were scenes of betrayal. Others were places where ambition quietly grew in the dark. And a few became the starting point for events that would change entire nations. Because behind the velvet curtains and candlelight, medieval royal life was often far messier than the official chronicles ever admitted. And sometimes, the most important moments in history happened in the quiet hours after the castle doors were closed. As we continue tonight's quiet journey through the strange and secretive world of medieval royal bedrooms, it becomes clear that these rooms were not just places where kings slept. They were places where trust could be broken, alliances quietly reshaped, and reputations destroyed without a single sword being drawn. One of the most unusual aspects of royal life during the medieval period was how little privacy even the most powerful people in the kingdom actually had. A king's bedroom was technically his most personal space, but in reality it was often filled with attendants who handled everything from lighting candles to guarding the doors. The king might attempt to rest while servants quietly walked across the chamber, adjusting curtains or preparing clothes for the morning. And if the king happened to be married, the queen faced similar circumstances. Royal marriages were rarely based on affection. Instead, they were carefully negotiated agreements between powerful families or rival kingdoms. A princess might travel hundreds of miles to marry a man she had never met before, stepping directly into a palace full of strangers who were watching her every move. The royal bedroom quickly became the place where these political arrangements were tested. If the couple produced children, the alliance was considered successful. If they did not, suspicion and pressure slowly began to grow. And in some cases, the king began to look elsewhere. One famous example of a royal marriage that slowly collapsed under pressure involved the English king often remembered as one of the most unusual rulers of the Middle Ages, Edward II. Edward ruled England during the early 14th century, and although he technically possessed enormous authority, his personal relationships created constant tension throughout his court. Edward's queen, Isabella of France, arrived in England as a young princess with enormous expectations placed upon her. She was intelligent, politically aware, and perfectly capable of performing the role of queen. But Edward's attention was often focused somewhere else entirely. From a young age, Edward had formed a close bond with a nobleman named Piers Gaveston. Their friendship was so intense that many members of the English nobility believed Gaveston had more influence over the king than anyone else in the kingdom. Edward showered Gaveston with gifts, titles, and land. He elevated him to positions of power that shocked the older nobles, who believed Gaveston lacked the background and discipline required for such authority. But the real problem was not just politics. It was closeness. Edward seemed emotionally devoted to Gaveston in a way that made many nobles deeply uncomfortable. At court gatherings, the two men spent enormous amounts of time together. They laughed together, planned events together, and often ignored the delicate political expectations surrounding the king's marriage. For Isabella, this situation was humiliating. She had arrived expecting to become one of the most important women in Europe. Yet she found herself sharing influence with someone the nobility openly resented. Rumors began to spread. Medieval chroniclers were rarely direct when discussing relationships like this, but their language often hinted at unusual intimacy. They wrote that Edward loved Gaveston excessively and could not bear to be separated from him. And separation eventually became unavoidable. The English barons demanded that Gaveston be exiled from the kingdom. Edward reluctantly agreed, but his loyalty to his friend remained so strong that he soon invited Gaveston back to court again. The nobles reacted with fury. Eventually Gaveston was captured and executed by rebellious lords who believed removing him was the only way to restore stability. Edward was devastated. Chroniclers described the king falling into deep grief, wearing mourning clothes and withdrawing emotionally from many of his royal duties. But the pattern soon repeated itself. Another favorite appeared. A nobleman named Hugh Despenser the Younger gradually rose to an even more powerful position beside the king. Hugh gained vast estates and influence, angering many powerful families who suddenly found themselves pushed aside. The royal bedroom, once again, became the center of political tension. Because whoever had the king's personal trust often had the king's political ear as well. And the resentment that grew around Edward's favorites eventually exploded into open rebellion. But England was not the only kingdom where royal relationships created dangerous consequences. Across the English Channel, the French court was dealing with one of the most shocking scandals of the medieval period. The Capetian dynasty ruled France during the early 14th century, and King Philip IV, sometimes called Philip the Fair because of his striking appearance, presided over a powerful but intensely controlled royal household. Philip valued order, discipline, and public morality, which made the scandal that erupted within his own family particularly dramatic. The king's sons had all married young noblewomen, strengthening alliances across Europe. But one day, Philip's daughter Isabella noticed something strange. She had given decorative purses to her sisters-in-law as gifts. Later, during a gathering at court, she noticed two knights carrying purses that looked suspiciously similar. Curiosity turned into suspicion. And suspicion turned into a full royal investigation. The result was one of the most notorious scandals in French royal history. Two princesses were accused of secretly meeting the knights in a tower known as the Tour de Nesle. Whether the accusations were completely true remains debated by historians, but the punishments were brutally real. The two knights were arrested, tortured, and executed in a public spectacle meant to demonstrate the consequences of betraying the royal family. The princesses themselves were imprisoned, their heads shaved, their titles stripped away. For years they remained locked away while the scandal echoed through European courts. And the strange thing about scandals like this was that they rarely remained private. Even in a world without newspapers or social media, gossip traveled extremely quickly. Traveling merchants, diplomats, and visiting nobles carried stories from one kingdom to another. Soon people across Europe were whispering about the disgrace of the French royal daughters-in-law. Meanwhile, the royal bedrooms where those secret meetings allegedly occurred became symbols of betrayal and political embarrassment. But not every royal bedroom scandal involved secret lovers. Sometimes the danger came from within the royal family itself. Because medieval courts were filled with ambitious relatives who quietly watched the throne, waiting for opportunities to rise higher. Brothers distrusted brothers. Uncles competed with nephews. And occasionally, family tensions ended in violence. Inside the quiet candlelit chambers of medieval castles, plots sometimes formed that would eventually reshape entire dynasties. But those darker stories are still ahead of us tonight. Because as we continue, we will encounter kings whose romantic obsessions destabilized their kingdoms, queens who turned betrayal into revenge, and royal relationships so complicated that even the chroniclers of the time struggled to describe them. For now, though, the castle corridors are growing quieter. The servants have finished their duties. Candles flicker against stone walls. And behind the heavy wooden doors of royal chambers, the private lives of kings and queens continue unfolding in ways that history books rarely describe out loud. As the candles continue to burn low in the stone chambers of medieval castles, the quiet hours of the night often became the time when the real personalities of kings and queens began to show. The formal ceremonies were over, the advisors had left, and the court had finally grown quiet. But even then, the royal bedroom rarely became the peaceful retreat we might imagine. For many rulers, these rooms became places where private frustrations, ambitions, and fears slowly revealed themselves. One ruler whose personal life caused endless gossip throughout Europe was the Castilian king often remembered for his dramatic and turbulent romances, Peter of Castile. Peter ruled Castile in the 14th century, and depending on who was writing about him, he was either a passionate lover or a deeply dangerous man with a habit of turning romantic conflicts into political disasters. Like many royal marriages of the time, Peter's official wedding had little to do with love. He was married to Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman whose marriage to the king was meant to strengthen diplomatic ties between France and Castile. The wedding itself was grand. There were celebrations, feasts, music, and enough wine to keep the entire court cheerful for days. But the marriage barely lasted long enough for the decorations to be taken down. Because almost immediately after the ceremony, Peter lost interest in his new queen. Instead, his attention was already fixed on another woman, Maria de Padilla. Maria had captured the king's affection long before the official marriage took place, and Peter showed very little interest in hiding his preference. Within days, the queen found herself quietly pushed aside while Maria became the true center of the king's attention. For the royal court, this created a deeply awkward situation. Diplomatic marriages were meant to secure alliances between powerful kingdoms, and humiliating a royal bride from France was not exactly a smart political strategy. But Peter seemed uninterested in political consequences. Queen Blanche was eventually confined within royal castles, separated from the king and largely removed from public life. Meanwhile, Maria de Padilla remained close to the king, and her influence quietly grew stronger. Even after Peter married other women for political reasons, Maria continued to hold a special place in his life. When she eventually died, Peter reportedly fell into deep mourning. He later declared that she had been his true and secret wife all along, a claim that confused many nobles and historians alike. But Peter's passionate nature did not always lead to romance. Sometimes it led to violence. Several stories from his reign described sudden punishments for those who angered him. Enemies were eliminated, rivals disappeared, and the atmosphere at court often felt tense and unpredictable. In fact, Peter's rule eventually ended in dramatic fashion when his own half-brother challenged him for the throne. The two brothers met in battle during the Battle of Montiel. According to some chroniclers, the conflict ended not only with swords on the battlefield but with a brutal confrontation between the brothers themselves. Peter was killed, bringing an end to one of the most chaotic reigns in Castilian history. But stories about the strange and dramatic relationships surrounding his court continued to circulate long after his death. And Peter was far from the only king whose personal life shaped the political fate of his kingdom. Further north in England, another ruler would become famous not just for his leadership but for the extraordinary number of children he left behind. That king was Charles II of England. Charles ruled during the 17th century, technically beyond the medieval period, but his court culture still carried many of the dramatic traditions that had developed during earlier centuries. After years of political chaos and civil war in England, Charles returned to the throne during an event known as the Restoration of the English monarchy. And when he returned, he seemed determined to make royal life feel less gloomy than it had during the strict rule of the previous government. The court of Charles II became lively, colorful, and sometimes scandalous. Theaters reopened. Music returned to the royal court. And the king developed a reputation for enjoying the company of numerous companions. Charles had many mistresses, several of whom became famous in their own right. One of the most well-known was Nell Gwynn, a former theatre performer whose humor and charm made her one of the most beloved figures at court. Another influential companion was Barbara Villiers, whose strong personality and political connections gave her considerable influence over royal decisions. Unlike some kings who tried to keep their private lives hidden, Charles seemed almost relaxed about the situation. He openly acknowledged many of his children born outside of marriage and gave them titles and positions within the aristocracy. The result was a royal family tree that grew impressively wide. Meanwhile, Charles's official queen, Catherine of Braganza, remained a respected but somewhat distant figure at court. She never produced an heir, which meant that many of Charles's acknowledged children could never legally inherit the throne. Still, the king's popularity remained strong. His court was lively, dramatic, and full of colorful personalities. And for many people living during that time, the royal bedroom seemed less like a place of quiet responsibility and more like the center of an elaborate social world. But as entertaining as these stories may sound, royal relationships could still become dangerous. Because jealousy, ambition, and rivalry were always waiting just beneath the surface of court life. And sometimes the people closest to the king were also the ones most capable of bringing down an entire royal household. So as the night continues and the castle halls grow even quieter, we'll soon encounter more rulers whose personal lives shape the course of history in unexpected ways. Kings whose romantic obsessions caused political crises. Queens who turned betrayal into carefully planned revenge. And royal courts where whispers in candlelit bedrooms eventually grew into storms that changed entire kingdoms. For now though, let the story slow down for a moment. The castle walls are thick. The corridors are quiet. And somewhere beyond those heavy wooden doors, the strange private world of medieval royalty continues unfolding long after the rest of the kingdom has fallen asleep. As we continue drifting through the quiet corridors of medieval castles tonight, it becomes increasingly clear that royal bedrooms were not only places of romance or scandal. Sometimes they became the silent stage for paranoia, jealousy, and decisions that would ripple through entire kingdoms. Because when someone held absolute power, even their private fears could become national problems. One ruler whose private life slowly slid into a strange mixture of romance and suspicion was Eric XIV of Sweden. Eric began his reign with promise. He was intelligent, educated, and deeply interested in astronomy and literature. Unlike many rulers of his time, he enjoyed writing poetry and studying the movements of the stars. But Eric also had an intense personality that sometimes made his court uneasy. He believed strongly in astrology and often consulted astrologers before making important decisions. In the medieval and early modern world, this was not entirely unusual. Many rulers believed the positions of planets could influence everything from war to marriage. However, Eric took these beliefs particularly seriously. If the stars suggested danger or betrayal, he could become deeply suspicious of the people around him. And unfortunately for his court, Eric's romantic life soon became tangled with his growing sense of paranoia. Eric fell deeply in love with a woman named Karin Mansdotter. Karin was not a princess or noblewoman. She was the daughter of a simple soldier and had worked as a servant before catching the king's attention. In a royal court filled with ambitious noble families, the king's affection for a commoner caused immediate shock. For many aristocrats, the idea that a woman of humble background might become queen felt almost unbelievable. But Eric did not seem interested in their opinions. He first brought Karin into his household as a companion, and over time their relationship deepened. Eventually, Eric did something that shocked nearly every powerful family in Sweden. He married her. The wedding elevated Karin from a common servant to Queen of Sweden, a transformation so dramatic that it sent waves of anxiety through the nobility. Some nobles believed the king was losing his sense of judgment. Others quietly feared that Karin's influence might disrupt the delicate balance of power within the court. And unfortunately, Eric's increasingly unstable behavior soon confirmed many of those fears. The king's suspicion of conspiracies began to grow. He became convinced that certain noble families were secretly plotting against him. Among those families were members of the powerful Sture family, who had long played important roles in Swedish politics. Erik's fears eventually led to one of the most disturbing incidents of his reign. In 1567, during a moment of extreme paranoia, Erik personally confronted several imprisoned nobles from the Sture family. The situation spiraled out of control, and the king himself became involved in violent acts against the prisoners. The event became known as the Sture murders. For the court, the message was clear. The king's private fears had turned into a national crisis. After the murders, Erik's authority began to crumble rapidly. Nobles who once served him faithfully now feared for their lives. Within a year, his own brothers led a rebellion that removed him from power. Erik spent the rest of his life imprisoned, far from the royal bedroom where his reign had once seemed so promising. His story is a reminder that the emotional lives of kings could shape the fate of entire nations. And Erik was not the only ruler whose romantic decisions shocked the political world. In France, centuries earlier, the court of Philip IV of France had already experienced a scandal that spread across Europe like wildfire. Philip ruled with a reputation for strict discipline and strong moral authority. He presented himself as a defender of justice and religious order. But as we heard earlier tonight, the scandal involving his daughters-in-law revealed how fragile royal reputations could be. The event became known as the Tour de Nesle affair. Two princesses of the French royal family were accused of secretly meeting knights inside a tower along the Seine River. Whether the accusations were entirely accurate is still debated, but the punishments were severe. The accused knights were executed, and the women were imprisoned for years. What made the scandal so powerful was not just the punishment itself. It was the humiliation. Royal families carefully protected their image of dignity and moral authority. When scandal exposed weakness inside the royal household, the entire political structure of the kingdom could feel unstable. And in the medieval world, where rumor traveled faster than official announcements, these stories spread quickly. Travelers carried gossip from court to court. Merchants repeated the stories in distant cities. Before long, people across Europe were whispering about the private lives of French royalty. Which brings us back again to the strange role of the royal bedroom. These rooms were meant to represent stability, marriage, dynasty, the continuation of royal bloodlines. Yet time and again, they became the starting point for gossip, suspicion, and dramatic political change. Because behind the ceremonies and silk curtains, kings and queens were still human beings. They fell in love with the wrong people. They trusted advisors who betrayed them. They made emotional decisions that historians would spend centuries trying to understand. And sometimes the quiet moments inside a royal chamber turned out to be the first step toward events that reshaped entire kingdoms. But as our slow journey through medieval history continues tonight, we are about to encounter even more unusual royal stories. Kings who refused to share their bedrooms with their wives. Queens who built secret networks of influence through private relationships. And rulers whose romantic obsessions quietly drained the strength of their kingdoms. As the night grows quieter and the candlelight flickers against cold castle walls, we continue wandering through the hidden and often uncomfortable truths behind medieval royal life. Because for all the crowns, jewels, and grand ceremonies, the private lives of kings and queens were rarely peaceful. Royal bedrooms were places where alliances were tested, reputations were damaged, and sometimes entire dynasties quietly shifted direction. One of the most dramatic examples of how private relationships could shape the fate of a kingdom can be found in the troubled reign of Edward II of England. Edward inherited the throne of England after the death of his father, the powerful warrior King Edward I of England. Edward I had been a strong and intimidating ruler, famous for military campaigns and strict authority over the nobility. Many nobles expected his son to continue that legacy. But Edward II was a very different kind of king. He was not particularly interested in war or rigid displays of authority. Instead, He valued personal friendships deeply and often placed enormous trust in the people closest to him. Unfortunately, that habit created enormous problems at court. The king's closest companion was a nobleman named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston had known Edward since childhood, and their friendship continued after Edward became king. But this was not an ordinary royal friendship. Edward gave Gaveston powerful titles, enormous estates, and prestigious positions within the government. At one point, he even made him the Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. To many English nobles, this was shocking. Gaveston was talented and charismatic, but he was not born into the highest ranks of aristocracy. Watching him rise so quickly angered many powerful families. The tension became even worse during Edward's coronation ceremony. At the event, Gaveston reportedly appeared wearing luxurious clothing that drew attention away from the Queen herself, Isabella of France. For a medieval royal court, this was an enormous social insult. Isabella had arrived from France as part of a carefully arranged diplomatic marriage. She represented an alliance between two powerful kingdoms. But at court she quickly discovered that her husband's emotional loyalty seemed focused elsewhere. The nobles were furious. They demanded Gaveston be removed from the kingdom entirely. Under pressure, Edward agreed to exile him. But the king soon brought him back. The cycle repeated itself again and again. Exile, return, anger, negotiation. Each time the situation grew more unstable. Eventually, a group of rebellious nobles captured Gaveston. He was executed in 1312. Edward was devastated by the loss. Chroniclers describe the king falling into deep grief, withdrawing from political duties and openly mourning his fallen companion. But the pattern soon repeated itself with another powerful favorite. This time it was Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh rose to extraordinary influence, gaining land and authority across England and Wales. Many nobles believed the Despenser family was using the king's personal trust to enrich themselves while ignoring the interests of the rest of the kingdom. Rebellion slowly began to build. And eventually the crisis reached a dramatic turning point. Edward's own queen, Isabella, formed an alliance with a powerful nobleman named Roger Mortimer. Together they launched an invasion of England. The rebellion succeeded. Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate the throne. His young son became king as Edward III of England. The former king was imprisoned, and his reign ended in one of the most dramatic political collapses in English medieval history. And once again, historians could trace the beginning of that collapse back to the complicated personal relationships that had developed within the king's private life. But England and France were not the only places where royal bedrooms shaped history. Across Europe, rulers struggled with the same mixture of power, desire, insecurity, and political pressure. Some kings became obsessed with producing heirs. Others became entangled in romantic relationships that slowly weakened their authority. And occasionally, the emotional life of a ruler created chaos that no army or advisor could repair. Yet for all these dramatic stories, one truth remains surprisingly consistent throughout medieval history. Kings and queens lived lives that were far less private than we might expect. Servants, guards, courtiers, physicians, and advisors moved constantly through royal chambers. Conversations whispered at night might be overheard. Rumors could spread before morning. And secrets rarely remained hidden for long. Which meant the royal bedroom was not just a place of rest. It was a stage where personal emotions and political power collided. And sometimes the quiet decisions made there would echo through the halls of history for centuries. But as our long journey continues tonight, there are still many strange royal stories waiting in the shadows of medieval castles. We will soon encounter rulers whose romantic obsessions reshaped dynasties, queens who turned betrayal into calculated revenge, and royal courts where whispered secrets quietly determined the fate of entire nations. So settle in once more. The night is long, the castle corridors are still, and beyond those heavy wooden doors the strange and fascinating private world of medieval royalty continues to unfold. As we continue wandering slowly through the dim corridors of medieval castles tonight, the deeper we go into the private lives of kings and queens, the more it becomes clear that royal bedrooms were not simply places for rest. They were spaces where ambition, jealousy, and fragile human emotions quietly shaped the fate of entire kingdoms. Because when a ruler held absolute power, even their personal relationships could ripple outward into politics, war, and rebellion. One ruler whose private life became famous across Europe for its drama and public spectacle was Alfonso XI of Castile. Alfonso began his reign during a time when the Iberian Peninsula was still deeply involved in the long conflict known as the Reconquista. He was a capable military leader and won important victories against rival forces, strengthening Castile's position in the region. But while Alfonso proved disciplined on the battlefield, his personal life created endless tension within his royal household. The king was married to Maria of Portugal, a princess whose marriage was meant to strengthen alliances between Castile and Portugal. Like many royal marriages, this one had been arranged for political stability rather than romance. And unfortunately for Maria, the king's heart was already occupied by someone else. That someone was Leonor de Guzman. Leonor was intelligent, ambitious, and extremely close to the king. Over time she became far more than a private companion. She effectively formed her own power network within the court. While Queen Maria lived in relative isolation, Leonor moved comfortably through the royal palace, surrounded by supporters and allies who benefited from her connection to the king. The situation became even more remarkable when Leonor began having children with Alfonso. Not just one or two, but many. In fact, Leonor gave birth to 10 children with the king, while the official queen struggled to produce heirs. These children, though technically illegitimate, were raised within noble circles and given powerful connections. For the queen, the humiliation was enormous. Imagine living in a royal court where your husband openly celebrated another woman and her growing family. Yet Maria endured the situation quietly for many years. Because challenging the king directly could have been politically dangerous. Meanwhile, Alfonso seemed entirely comfortable with the arrangement. Leonor accompanied him frequently and received lands, privileges, and influence within the kingdom. Many nobles resented this situation deeply, but few were willing to openly challenge the king while he remained alive. But history has a strange way of balancing long-standing tensions. In 1350, Alfonso XI died during an outbreak of the Black Death. The plague swept through Europe with terrifying speed, ending countless lives regardless of wealth or status. And with Alfonso gone, the delicate balance of power inside the Castilian court collapsed overnight. Queen Maria, who had endured years of humiliation, suddenly found herself with the opportunity to act. Leonor de Guzman was arrested. She was imprisoned and eventually executed. For many historians, the event was seen as a dramatic moment of delayed revenge. Years of quiet resentment finally found release once the king who had protected Leonor was no longer there. It is one of the most striking reminders that royal bedrooms were not simply places of romance or scandal. They were places where long memories were formed. Where people quietly waited for the right moment to shift the balance of power. And sometimes that moment arrived only after decades of patience. But the strange dynamics of royal relationships did not end there. Because across Europe, royal courts were filled with powerful mistresses, complicated marriages, and rulers who struggled to balance personal desire with political responsibility. In France, England, Spain, and Scandinavia, historians can find endless stories of kings whose romantic lives created ripple effects across their kingdoms. Sometimes those stories are dramatic. Sometimes they are tragic. And occasionally they are almost strangely human. Because despite the crowns and castles, the people living inside these stone walls were still dealing with the same emotions that shape human relationships today. Love. Jealousy. Pride. Fear. And the complicated desire to be remembered. But as the candles burn lower and the quiet of the night deepens, our journey through the secret world of medieval royal bedrooms is far from over. Because ahead of us lie even more unusual stories. Kings who built entire courts around their favorite companions. Queens who used charm and intelligence to quietly dominate politics. And rulers whose private decisions slowly changed the direction of history. Now as the night grows deeper and the castle corridors fall silent, we continue our slow walk through the private chambers of medieval royalty. Behind the thick stone walls and heavy wooden doors, the lives of kings and queens were rarely as orderly as official records tried to suggest. Royal bedrooms, despite their elegant tapestries and grand beds, often became the quiet stage where human weakness and political power collided in unexpected ways. And sometimes, the strangest stories came not from kings alone, but from the powerful women who shared their lives. One of the most fascinating figures in European royal history was Catherine de' Medici. Catherine arrived in France as a young Italian noblewoman when she married Henry II of France. At first, her position at court seemed secure. She was intelligent, well-educated, and came from the powerful Medici banking family of Florence. But Catherine soon discovered that the king's heart already belonged to someone else. That someone was Diane de Poitiers. Diane was older than the king by nearly 20 years, yet she held extraordinary influence over him. She was elegant, disciplined, and remarkably skilled at navigating court politics. Henry trusted her completely. In fact, Diane's influence was so strong that she controlled many aspects of royal life. She managed estates, oversaw financial decisions, and even appeared beside the king at important ceremonies. For Catherine, the situation must have been deeply frustrating. Imagine being the Queen of France while another woman held the king's affection and political attention. Yet Catherine did something remarkable. Instead of openly confronting Diane, she waited. Quietly. Patiently. She fulfilled her duties as queen and focused on one crucial responsibility, producing heirs to the French throne. Over time, Catherine gave birth to several children who would eventually become kings of France. This strengthened her position within the royal family and ensured that her influence would grow in the future. Meanwhile, Diane remained close to Henry, guiding many of his decisions and maintaining her powerful role at court. But royal fortunes can change quickly. In 1559, Henry II was injured during a jousting tournament when a splinter from a lance struck his face through the visor of his helmet. The injury proved fatal. With the king gone, the balance of power at court shifted almost overnight. Catherine, now the queen mother to the young King Francis II of France, finally stepped into the political authority she had patiently waited for. And one of her first actions was directed toward Diane. The former royal favorite was politely but firmly removed from court. Her influence vanished almost instantly. For years Diane had stood at the center of royal attention. Now she quietly withdrew to her estates, living out the rest of her life far from the political world she had once dominated. Catherine, meanwhile, became one of the most powerful political figures in France. Her story reveals something important about royal life. Not all influence came from passion or romance. Sometimes it came from patience. From understanding that power inside a royal court could shift like the tide. But of course, not every royal relationship unfolded with such careful strategy. Some kings behaved with far less restraint. In England, for example, one of the most infamous rulers when it came to marriage and royal bedrooms was Henry VIII. Henry's determination to secure a male heir led him through 6 marriages, each one creating new political and religious conflicts. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been married to him for many years. Their union had begun with genuine respect and stability. But when Catherine failed to produce a surviving male heir, Henry became convinced that the marriage was cursed. His desire to end the marriage and marry another woman, Anne Boleyn, led to one of the most dramatic religious shifts in European history. When the Pope refused to grant a divorce, Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church entirely. The result was the creation of the English Reformation. An entire nation's religious structure changed partly because of the personal frustrations and ambitions of one king. And the royal bedroom once again proved capable of influencing the fate of millions. Anne Boleyn eventually became queen, but her own story ended tragically when she was accused of treason and executed. Henry went on to marry 4 more times, each marriage carrying its own mixture of hope, anxiety, and political calculation. Looking back across these stories, one pattern appears again and again. The private lives of rulers were never truly private. Servants whispered about them. Courtiers gossiped about them. Foreign ambassadors reported on them to distant kingdoms. The royal bedroom became one of the most carefully watched spaces in the entire palace. And sometimes the smallest personal decision made within those chambers could set entire kingdoms on a new course. But our journey tonight is not finished yet. There are still more strange royal lives waiting behind the doors of medieval castles. Kings who believed prophecy controlled their marriages. Queens who quietly plotted revenge against unfaithful husbands. And rulers whose romantic obsessions led to some of the most bizarre stories ever recorded in royal history. So as the night continues and the quiet of the castle grows deeper, our slow journey through the secret world of royal bedrooms brings us to another curious truth about medieval and early royal life. Power did not always belong to the person wearing the crown. Sometimes it belonged to the person sitting beside the crown, or occasionally, lying beside it. Throughout European history, royal courts developed an unusual and sometimes uncomfortable tradition. Kings often formed deep attachments to certain companions who were not their queens. These companions could become confidants, advisors, and sometimes the quiet center of influence inside a palace. And few royal courts demonstrated this strange balance of affection and power more clearly than the French court during the reign of Louis XV of France. Now, technically speaking, Louis XV ruled long after the medieval period had ended, but many traditions of royal life had changed very little. Palaces were still full of whispering courtiers, careful alliances, and the constant competition for royal attention. Louis XV was known for his charm and elegance, but he also developed a reputation for maintaining a long list of companions who lived quietly within the royal environment. One of the most famous was Madame de Pompadour. Pompadour was not simply a romantic companion to the king. She was intelligent, cultured, and deeply involved in the cultural life of France. She supported artists, writers, and architects, helping shape the artistic style of the era. More importantly, she became a trusted advisor. Foreign diplomats understood that gaining Pompadour's approval could be almost as important as gaining the king's. Many political decisions passed through her influence. This created a strange reality within the palace. The official queen, Maria Leszczyńska, maintained the formal dignity of her position, attending ceremonies and representing royal tradition. Meanwhile, Pompadour quietly shaped the cultural and political atmosphere surrounding the king. But even this unusual arrangement was not the strangest part of Louis XV's private life. Later in his reign, rumors began circulating about a secluded residence near the palace where several young women lived under royal protection. The residence became known as the Parc aux Cerfs. Stories about the building spread quickly through Paris. Some claimed it was simply a private household for royal companions. Others imagined far more dramatic possibilities. Historians today still debate the truth behind these rumors. Some accounts were likely exaggerated by critics of the monarchy. But the existence of such stories reveals something important about royal courts. When a king's private life became mysterious, imagination quickly filled the gaps. And imagination, once it begins spreading through a city or kingdom, can be far more powerful than the truth. Royal reputations could rise or collapse depending on how those stories were told. This pattern appeared again and again throughout history. Kings lived under constant observation. Every gesture, every relationship, every whisper from inside the palace walls could become public knowledge within days. Servants talked. Guards listened. Visitors carried stories from court to court. Before long, the private world of the royal bedroom became public entertainment for an entire nation. But there were also rulers whose private habits were not scandalous, but simply unusual. Take for example Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor. Rudolph ruled from Prague and was far more interested in art, science, and strange experiments than in traditional royal duties. His palace became famous for its collections of paintings, rare animals, mechanical inventions, and mysterious objects gathered from across Europe and beyond. Rather than filling his nights with courtly romance, Rudolf often spent long hours studying alchemy and astronomy. He believed that hidden knowledge could unlock secrets about the universe. While other kings hosted lavish social gatherings, Rudolf's palace became a gathering place for scholars, astrologers, and scientists. His private chambers were filled with books, instruments, and curious artifacts rather than romantic drama. For some observers, this made him appear eccentric. For others, he was simply a ruler whose passions followed a different path. And perhaps that is one of the most interesting lessons hidden within these stories. Royal bedrooms were not always scenes of scandal. Sometimes they were quiet spaces where rulers revealed their true personalities. Some kings sought affection. Some sought power. Some sought knowledge. And others simply tried to escape the endless pressure of ruling a kingdom. Because wearing a crown might grant immense authority, but it also placed enormous expectations on the person wearing it. And sometimes, the only place a ruler could briefly be themselves was inside the quiet walls of their private chamber. But our journey through the strange and secret world of royal bedrooms is still not finished. Ahead of us lie even more unusual stories. Kings whose romantic obsessions reshaped dynasties. Queens who quietly controlled entire courts. And royal families whose complicated relationships turned palace life into something that sometimes resembled a very dramatic historical theater. Now as the night stretches on and the castle halls fall into deeper silence, our quiet exploration of royal bedrooms reveals another truth about life inside medieval and early royal courts. For all their power and ceremony, kings and queens lived under a strange kind of constant observation. Their private lives were never entirely private. Servants passed through their chambers, guards stood at doors, and courtiers paid careful attention to even the smallest signs of royal favor. Because sometimes a single smile from a king could change someone's entire future. And sometimes a single moment of jealousy could change the fate of a kingdom. One of the most dramatic examples of how royal relationships shaped politics can be seen in the life of Anne Boleyn and the English King Henry VIII. When Henry first noticed Anne at court, she was serving as a lady-in-waiting. Intelligent, confident, and unusually outspoken for the time, and quickly captured the king's attention. But unlike many women at court who had accepted the role of royal companion, Anne did something unexpected. She refused to become the king's private mistress. Instead, she insisted on something far more ambitious. Marriage. For Henry, this created an enormous problem. He was already married to Catherine of Aragon, a respected queen whose marriage had lasted more than 2 decades. Ending that marriage required approval from the Pope. And the Pope refused. What followed became one of the most dramatic turning points in European history. Henry decided that if the Church would not allow him to end his marriage, he would simply create a new religious authority inside England. The result was the English Reformation. Monasteries were dissolved. Church lands were redistributed. And the king declared himself the head of the Church in England. All of this political and religious upheaval grew partly from a personal relationship that began inside the quiet halls of a royal court. Eventually Henry married Anne Boleyn. For a brief moment, she stood at the center of royal power as Queen of England. But life inside a royal bedroom could be dangerously unpredictable. When Anne failed to produce the long-awaited male heir, Henry's affection began to fade. Political enemies gathered around her, whispering accusations and spreading rumors. In 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with treason. The accusations included conspiracy and betrayal, charges that historians still debate today. She was executed at the Tower of London, a place that had witnessed many dramatic moments in English royal history. For someone who had once transformed the entire religious structure of a kingdom, Anne's fall from power happened with astonishing speed. Her story reveals just how fragile royal favor could be. But not every powerful royal woman lost her influence so suddenly. Some queens managed to transform their positions into lasting political strength. One remarkable example was Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and Boleyn, and her childhood was shaped by the dramatic events surrounding her mother's downfall. When Elizabeth eventually became queen, she made an unusual decision. She chose never to marry. Throughout her reign, European kings and princes repeatedly proposed marriage, hoping to form alliances with England. But Elizabeth carefully avoided committing to any one suitor. Instead, she used the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool. Foreign rulers continued negotiating with her for years, hoping she might eventually choose them. Meanwhile, Elizabeth maintained complete control over her throne and her court. Her decision transformed the royal bedroom into something entirely different. Rather than becoming the center of political marriage alliances, it became a symbol of independence. Elizabeth's court still contained close friendships and rumored romantic interests, including the nobleman Robert Dudley. But Elizabeth never allowed any relationship to threaten her authority. She became known as the Virgin Queen, a title that strengthened the image of a ruler devoted entirely to her kingdom. And for more than 40 years, she governed England during a period of cultural growth and political stability. Her story reminds us that royal bedrooms did not always create scandal. Sometimes they represented restraint. Sometimes they represented careful political strategy. And sometimes they represented the quiet determination of a ruler who understood exactly how much influence those private spaces could hold. Because behind the grand ceremonies and glittering crowns, the personal lives of rulers remain deeply connected to the fate of their kingdoms. A marriage could create peace. A relationship could cause rebellion. A private decision could reshape an entire nation. And that is why the royal bedroom remains one of the most fascinating places in the story of history. Not because of romance alone, but because of the enormous consequences that sometimes began in those quiet rooms behind castle doors. But our journey through these strange and secret royal worlds is still far from finished. There are still kings whose obsessions reshaped their courts, queens who quietly outmaneuvered their rivals, and royal families whose complicated relationships turned medieval castles into places of endless drama. As the night deepens and the quiet halls of old castles seem almost frozen in time, our journey through the strange and secret world of royal bedrooms continues. By now it's becoming clear that behind the polished image of kings and queens, royal life was filled with complicated emotions, fragile alliances, and very human weaknesses. The bedroom of a ruler was never just a place of rest. It was a place where relationships formed, rivalries quietly grew, and sometimes entire political storms began to gather. And sometimes those storms began with a single favorite. Across Europe, many kings developed intense attachments to particular companions. These companions could be advisors, friends, or romantic partners, but whatever their role, their closeness to the king often caused unease among the rest of the court. Because access to the king meant influence. And influence meant power. One ruler whose private attachments caused enormous political turmoil was James I of England. James had grown up in a turbulent political environment in Scotland, where kings were constantly surrounded by intrigue and danger. By the time he inherited the English throne as well, he had developed a strong need for loyal companions he could trust completely. One of those companions was George Villiers. Villiers rose at astonishing speed through the royal court. Within a few years he became one of the most powerful men in England, receiving titles, wealth, and access to the king that other nobles could only dream of. Many courtiers were stunned by how quickly Villiers gained influence. But the king clearly valued his presence. James wrote affectionate letters to Villiers and trusted him with important political responsibilities. Foreign ambassadors even reported that gaining Villiers' approval was sometimes the fastest way to influence royal policy. For the nobles of England, this situation created quiet resentment. They watched as one man seemed to move effortlessly through the royal court while others struggled to maintain their traditional positions. Once again, the king's private relationships had become a political issue. But James was far from the only ruler whose personal attachments reshaped court life. In Russia, the royal household of Peter the Great revealed a completely different kind of royal personality. Peter was famous for his energy, curiosity, and determination to transform Russia into a more modern state. He traveled across Europe studying shipbuilding, science, and engineering. But Peter's private life could be just as dramatic as his public reforms. He eventually married Catherine I of Russia, a woman whose origins were far humbler than those of most royal brides. Catherine had been born into a modest background and had experienced a difficult early life before entering the royal household. Yet she impressed Peter with her resilience and intelligence. During difficult military campaigns and political struggles, Catherine remained close to the Tsar, supporting him through moments of exhaustion and frustration. Over time, Peter grew deeply devoted to her. Their relationship stood out in a royal world where many marriages were purely political arrangements. Eventually Peter crowned Catherine as empress, elevating her to a position few could have imagined when she first arrived at court. And when Peter died, Catherine herself briefly ruled Russia as empress. Her story demonstrated something rare in royal history. Sometimes affection and loyalty, rather than political strategy alone, could shape the future of a nation. But as our journey continues tonight, one pattern remains consistent across all these stories. Royal bedrooms were places where the boundaries between personal life and political power almost disappeared. A king's affection could lift someone from obscurity to enormous influence. A queen's patience could reshape the future of a dynasty. And a single moment of jealousy or suspicion could lead to consequences that historians would debate for centuries. Inside those quiet chambers, surrounded by candlelight and guarded doors, rulers made decisions that seemed personal in the moment. Yet those decisions often echoed far beyond the walls of the palace. Wars were fought. Alliances were broken. Kingdoms were transformed. And all of it sometimes began with something as simple, and as complicated, as a relationship between two people. So as we continue our slow walk through the hidden corners of royal history, remember that behind every crown was a human being trying to navigate power, loyalty, ambition, and emotion all at the same time. And sometimes the quietest rooms in a castle held the loudest secrets in history. The night is still long, the candles are still burning softly, and the private world of kings and queens still holds many stories waiting to be told. As the night continues and the quiet of the castle deepens, our slow walk through the private chambers of royal history reveals another strange truth. The lives of kings and queens were filled with rituals that today might feel almost unbelievable. Even the simple act of going to bed or waking up could become a formal ceremony, watched by dozens of attendants and courtiers. In some royal courts, the king's morning routine was practically a public event. One of the most famous examples of this unusual tradition existed in the court of Louis XIV. Louis ruled France during the 17th century and built one of the most extravagant royal courts in European history at the magnificent Palace of Versailles. Versailles was designed not only as a residence but as a carefully controlled world where every movement of the king followed strict rules of ceremony. Even the king's waking moment each morning was turned into a formal ritual called the lever, where selected nobles were allowed to enter the royal chamber and watch as the king began his day. Only the most important nobles were allowed to help with certain tasks, handing the king his shirt, presenting water for washing, or assisting with clothing. To modern ears, the idea of dozens of people standing inside the royal bedroom while the king got dressed might sound uncomfortable. But for the nobles of France, being present at these ceremonies was considered an enormous honor. It meant they were close to the center of royal power. And in a court where influence meant everything, proximity to the king could determine a person's entire future. But even in a palace as grand and carefully organized as Versailles, the king's private life still attracted endless attention. Louis XIV was married to Maria Theresa of Spain, a political match designed to strengthen alliances between France and Spain. Their marriage produced several children, ensuring the continuation of the royal line. Yet Louis also formed relationships with several influential companions during his long reign. One of the most famous was Madame de Montespan, a charismatic and ambitious woman who became one of the most powerful figures at the royal court. Montespan's beauty and wit captured the king's attention, and soon she was living at Versailles surrounded by luxury and influence. She bore several children with the king, many of whom he later acknowledged and granted noble titles. For years she remained one of the central personalities at court, attracting admiration, envy, and endless gossip. But life inside royal courts rarely remained stable forever. Over time, another woman quietly rose in influence around the king. Her name was Madame de Maintenon. Maintenon began as a governess responsible for caring for the king's children. She was calm, intelligent, and far less interested in the dramatic social life of the palace. Gradually, the king grew to respect her wisdom and quiet presence. Their relationship developed slowly and carefully, far from the dramatic scandals that often surrounded other court relationships. Eventually, after the death of Queen Maria Theresa, Louis secretly married Madame de Maintenon. The marriage was never publicly announced as an official royal union, but their partnership became widely known within the palace. Maintenon's influence encouraged the king to adopt a more serious and disciplined lifestyle in his later years. The lively celebrations and endless entertainments of earlier decades slowly gave way to a quieter atmosphere at court. Once again, the royal bedroom had quietly reshaped the culture of an entire court. And that pattern appears again and again throughout royal history. Behind every throne stood a network of personal relationships. Friendships. Rivalries. Romantic attachments. Moments of loyalty and betrayal. These relationships might begin in private rooms, far away from the eyes of the public. But their consequences often reached far beyond those walls. Kings listened to trusted companions. Queens quietly guided their children toward future power. Advisors whispered ideas during late-night conversations. And sometimes those conversations altered the course of nations. When historians look back at royal history, they often focus on battles, treaties, and political reforms. But many of the most important decisions in history began not in council chambers or battlefields, but in the quiet, candlelit rooms where rulers revealed their most human sides. And that is why the royal bedroom remains one of the most fascinating spaces in the entire story of monarchy. It was a place where power and vulnerability existed side by side. A place where kings were not only rulers, but husbands, lovers, parents, and sometimes deeply uncertain individuals trying to navigate the enormous weight of a crown. But our journey tonight is not finished yet. There are still many strange corners of royal history waiting for us, rulers whose private lives baffled their courts, queens whose patience reshaped dynasties, and royal families whose complicated relationships turned castles into stages for endless drama. As the candles continue to flicker and the deep quiet of the castle settles in, our slow journey through the private world of royal bedrooms reveals yet another curious pattern in the lives of kings and queens. Despite the immense wealth surrounding them, royal couples often struggled with something surprisingly ordinary. Trust. Because inside a palace filled with ambitious nobles, spies, and political rivals, even the most personal relationships could feel uncertain. A king might wonder whether affection was genuine or simply a strategy for gaining influence. A queen might question whether loyalty at court would last beyond the next political shift. And sometimes, those doubts grew into something far more dangerous. One of the most dramatic examples of suspicion turning into royal tragedy can be seen in the life of Ivan IV of Russia. Ivan ruled Russia during the 16th century and became one of the most feared rulers in European history. Early in his reign he was intelligent, determined, and eager to strengthen the Russian state. But years of political conspiracies, betrayals, and personal losses slowly changed his personality. Ivan's private life was marked by multiple marriages, several of which ended in tragedy or scandal. Royal marriages in Russia, much like those elsewhere in Europe, were deeply connected to political alliances. Yet Ivan's relationships often became entangled with his growing paranoia. Inside the royal palace, he began to suspect plots everywhere. Nobles, advisors, and even members of his own household sometimes fell under his suspicion. The atmosphere around him grew tense and fearful. Servants whispered quietly. Courtiers avoided drawing too much attention. Even small disagreements could trigger sudden bursts of anger from the ruler. One of the most heartbreaking moments in Ivan's life involved his own family. During a heated argument inside the palace, Ivan struck his son, Ivan Ivanovich. The blow proved fatal. The tragic event shocked the royal court and left the Tsar devastated. Paintings and historical accounts later portrayed the moment as one of the most painful scenes in Russian royal history. The story reminds us that even within the most powerful royal households, personal emotions could spiral into consequences no one intended. But while Ivan's court became known for fear and suspicion, other royal courts developed reputations for almost the opposite atmosphere. Some rulers preferred pleasure and celebration over strict discipline. One such king was Charles II of England. After years of civil war and political upheaval in England, Charles returned to the throne during the restoration of the English monarchy. The new king seemed determined to make royal life lively again. Theaters reopened. Music filled the royal court. Lavish parties and gatherings became common. And Charles himself developed a reputation as one of the most socially active kings in English history. His court was filled with actors, artists, musicians, and charismatic personalities. Charles formed close relationships with several well-known companions, including the famous actress Nell Gwyn. Nell Gwyn's wit and humor made her beloved by many people in London, and she became one of the most famous figures at court. Unlike some royal companions who tried to hide their influence, Nell was known for her lively personality and sharp sense of humor. Charles acknowledged several of his children born outside of marriage and provided them with noble titles and estates. The result was a royal household that felt less rigid than many others in Europe. Where some courts were dominated by suspicion or rigid ceremony, Charles's court often felt like an ongoing social gathering. But even in such a lively environment, the delicate balance of royal relationships remained important. Because every friendship, every romance, every quiet conversation still had the potential to influence politics. And that brings us back once again to the strange importance of royal bedrooms. These rooms were not simply places for sleep or privacy. They were crossroads where personal lives and national history quietly met. A king might discuss war plans late at night with a trusted advisor. A queen might guide the education of the next ruler while sitting beside a cradle. A favorite companion might whisper an idea that would eventually become royal policy. Behind the tapestries and candlelight, the quiet hours of the night often shaped decisions that echoed across kingdoms. And that is what makes the hidden world of royal bedrooms so endlessly fascinating. Because within those quiet spaces, rulers revealed the parts of themselves that official history often tries to smooth over. Their fears. Their passions. Their loyalties. Their mistakes. All of it unfolding quietly behind heavy wooden doors while the rest of the kingdom slept. And as our long journey continues through these shadowy halls of royal history, there are still more strange stories waiting ahead, rulers whose private obsessions baffled their courts, queens whose patience reshaped entire dynasties, and royal families whose complicated relationships turned castles into places of endless intrigue. As the night deepens and the wind moves softly through the narrow windows of our imagined medieval castle, the stories of royal lives continue to unfold, slowly, quietly. Like the turning pages of an old chronicle. History often remembers kings for their wars, their crowns, and the borders they changed. But behind those public achievements were private lives that could be complicated, messy, and sometimes deeply strange. Royal households were not simply families. They were political systems in miniature, where every relationship could affect the stability of a kingdom. And because of that, even the most personal decisions of a ruler could become matters of national importance. A fascinating example of this dynamic appears in the life of Philip IV of France. Philip ruled during the late 13th and early 14th centuries and was known for his calm appearance and carefully controlled personality. His nickname, Philip the Fair, referred not only to his appearance but also to the composed dignity he displayed in public. Yet beneath that composed image, his court became the center of one of the most dramatic scandals in medieval Europe. The scandal involved members of the royal family itself, including Philip's daughters-in-law. The event later became known as the Tour de Nesle affair. According to contemporary accounts, rumors began circulating that several royal women were secretly meeting with knights in a tower near the Seine River in Paris. Whether the accusations were fully true or partially exaggerated by political enemies remains debated by historians. But when the rumors reached the king, Philip ordered a full investigation. The results shocked the royal court. Several knights were arrested and brutally punished, while 2 princesses were imprisoned for life. One of them was Margaret of Burgundy, who died in captivity soon after. The scandal shook the French monarchy and damaged the reputation of the royal family across Europe. It also demonstrated something important about medieval power. Royal families were expected to represent stability and moral authority. When scandals erupted, they threatened not only personal reputations but also the legitimacy of entire dynasties. For kings like Philip IV, controlling the behavior of the royal household became part of protecting the kingdom itself. But not every ruler responded to personal controversies with strict discipline. Some embraced a lifestyle filled with indulgence and spectacle. One of the most colorful courts in European history belonged to Frederick I of Württemberg. Frederick ruled during the early 19th century, a time when Europe was undergoing enormous political changes during the era of Napoleonic Wars. Frederick himself was known for his enormous physical size and larger-than-life personality. His royal court became famous for lavish banquets, extravagant celebrations, and elaborate ceremonies that sometimes lasted late into the night. Foreign visitors who attended these events often wrote detailed descriptions of the unusual atmosphere inside the palace. Music echoed through grand halls. Tables overflowed with food and wine. And courtiers competed to entertain the king with performances, storytelling, and theatrical displays. For Frederick, royal life was meant to be impressive and unforgettable. These celebrations were not simply entertainment. They were also a way for rulers to display wealth and authority. In a world where most people lived modest lives, the spectacle of royal luxury reinforced the idea that kings stood above ordinary society. But beneath the glittering surface of palace life, tensions still existed. Rivalries between nobles could flare up at any moment. Political alliances shifted constantly. And even during the most joyful celebrations, everyone in the room knew that the balance of power could change quickly. This mixture of celebration and uncertainty was a defining feature of royal courts throughout medieval and early modern history. Every castle hallway held whispers. Every banquet table carried hidden conversations. Every royal chamber could become the setting for a decision that changed the future of a kingdom. As we continue our long journey through these shadowy corridors of history, it becomes clear that the lives of kings were never as simple as the golden crowns they wore. They lived surrounded by luxury, yet often trapped within systems of expectation and scrutiny. Their marriages were arranged for politics. Their friendships were watched carefully. Even their private moments could become the subject of gossip across an entire continent. And yet, despite all that pressure, these rulers were still human beings, capable of love, jealousy, curiosity, ambition, and sometimes surprising eccentricity. That is what makes these stories so captivating. They reveal the hidden side of power. The quiet world behind the throne. And the strange, sometimes unbelievable ways that personal lives and world history became intertwined. The candles are still burning in the castle corridors. The night is far from over. And there are still many more curious tales waiting in the long and complicated history of kings. The night inside our quiet castle grows deeper now. The halls are dim, the torches burn low, and somewhere in the distance the sound of footsteps echoes along cold stone floors. Royal palaces were never truly silent. Even late at night, servants moved quietly through corridors, guards stood watch at doors, and scribes worked by candlelight recording the decisions of kings. Because ruling a kingdom never truly stopped. And yet, some rulers were far more focused on their personal lives than on the endless paperwork of governing. One such figure whose reputation fascinated historians for centuries was Augustus II the Strong. Augustus lived during the late 17th and early 18th centuries and quickly became known across Europe for two things: his extraordinary physical strength and his equally extraordinary romantic reputation. Stories about his strength were legendary. It was said he could bend horseshoes with his bare hands or snap iron bars during displays meant to impress foreign visitors. Whether all of these stories were true or slightly exaggerated by enthusiastic supporters is still debated. But there was no doubt that Augustus enjoyed showing off his abilities. Yet what truly captured the imagination of European society was the enormous number of relationships attributed to him. Royal courts across the continent whispered constantly about the king's romantic adventures. Some historians estimate that Augustus may have had dozens of companions during his lifetime, and he acknowledged many children born outside of marriage. One of the most famous women connected to him was Anna Constantia von Cosel. She was intelligent, ambitious, and for a time held remarkable influence at court. Anna Constantia believed her relationship with the king would eventually lead to a formal marriage, a possibility that alarmed many powerful nobles. Political tensions quickly grew. Eventually the relationship collapsed, and she was imprisoned for many years in a fortress overlooking the Elbe River. Her story became one of the most dramatic cautionary tales in royal history. It showed how quickly fortune could change inside a palace. A person who enjoyed enormous influence one year might lose everything the next. And Augustus himself eventually turned his attention to other political matters as Europe moved toward new conflicts and alliances. But while Augustus ruled in a court famous for its energy and spectacle, other royal courts developed reputations for something far darker. Few rulers illustrate this better than Caligula. Although Caligula ruled during the early years of the Roman Empire, long before the medieval period, his reputation became legendary in later European storytelling about corrupt rulers. Ancient writers described a ruler who began his reign with enormous popularity but gradually became increasingly unpredictable. According to historical accounts, Caligula staged elaborate public games, extravagant feasts, and unusual performances designed to astonish the Roman population. But as time passed, reports of bizarre behavior began to circulate. Some writers claimed he ordered statues of himself placed in temples, demanded extreme displays of loyalty from senators, and staged spectacles meant to demonstrate his absolute power. Modern historians debate how much of this reputation was exaggerated by political enemies writing after his death. Ancient history often blends fact with dramatic storytelling. Yet the image of Caligula as an unpredictable ruler remained powerful for centuries. Writers during the medieval and Renaissance periods frequently used him as an example of what could happen when absolute power was combined with personal instability. In other words, Caligula became less of a historical figure and more of a warning. A reminder that unchecked authority could lead rulers into strange and sometimes destructive behavior. And when we look across the long history of kings and emperors, that lesson appears again and again. Power creates opportunity. But it also creates temptation. A ruler surrounded by luxury, flattery, and constant praise might slowly begin to believe that ordinary rules no longer apply to them. And that belief could lead to surprising, sometimes shocking, decisions. But history also shows another side of royal life. Because for every ruler who became famous for excess, there were others who struggled quietly with loneliness. The life of a monarch could be strangely isolating. Friendships were difficult when everyone around you depended on your favor. Romantic relationships were complicated by politics. Even family members could become rivals. Some kings and queens spent much of their lives wondering who around them truly cared about them as individuals rather than as sources of power. And that quiet loneliness sometimes shaped the private choices rulers made. Behind the gold crowns and velvet robes were human beings trying to navigate lives that few ordinary people could truly understand. That mixture of privilege and isolation is one of the most fascinating aspects of royal history. It reminds us that the people who shaped nations were not simply distant figures in paintings or statues. They were individuals with emotions, fears, ambitions, and flaws. And those personal experiences often influenced the direction of entire kingdoms. The castle halls are quieter now. The candles burn lower. But our journey through the hidden lives of rulers is far from finished. Because across the centuries, countless stories remain waiting in the shadows, stories of ambition, scandal, rivalry, loyalty, and strange human behavior behind palace doors. The night grows even quieter now. Outside the castle walls, the wind moves slowly across dark fields, and somewhere in the distance a church bell marks the passing of another late hour. Inside the palace, however, the quiet hides a complicated world of relationships, ambitions, and whispered conversations. Royal courts were never simple places. Every person inside them had a purpose: advisors planning strategies, nobles seeking influence, artists hoping for patronage, and servants carrying messages from one chamber to another. But among all these roles, one of the most unusual positions was that of the royal favorite. A royal favorite was someone who enjoyed the special personal trust of the king or queen. Sometimes they were advisors, sometimes close friends, and sometimes companions whose influence extended far beyond what their official title suggested. Few royal favorites became as famous as Piers Gaveston. Gaveston arrived at the English court as a young knight and quickly caught the attention of the future king, Edward II of England. Edward admired Gaveston's charisma, humor, and confidence. The two developed a very close friendship, and when Edward became king in 1307, he immediately elevated Gaveston's position. He granted him titles, lands, and privileges that many powerful nobles believed were far too generous. At first, this might not seem unusual. Kings often rewarded trusted companions. But Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston was so visible that it angered many of the kingdom's most powerful lords. Some nobles believed Gaveston was influencing royal decisions. Others were offended by the way he mocked them openly during court gatherings. The tension grew quickly. Within a few years, powerful barons forced the king to exile Gaveston from England. Edward, however, repeatedly invited him back, unwilling to give up the companionship he valued so highly. The conflict escalated until a group of rebellious nobles captured Gaveston. In 1312, they executed him without the king's permission. The event shocked the kingdom and deeply affected Edward II. The loss of his closest companion made his already difficult reign even more unstable. Historians still debate the exact nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship, but what is clear is that the king's personal loyalty to his favorite had enormous political consequences. It's a reminder that private emotions inside royal courts could reshape the course of national politics. And Edward II's story does not end there. Years later, he formed another close relationship with a noble named Hugh Despenser the Younger. Just like Gaveston before him, Despenser gained significant power at court. But this time the political reaction was even more explosive. Powerful nobles rebelled again, accusing the Despenser family of abusing their influence. The conflict eventually led to a full-scale uprising against the king. Edward's own wife, Isabella of France, joined forces with rebellious nobles and returned to England with an invading army. The king was captured. Despenser was executed. And Edward II was forced to give up the throne in favor of his young son, Edward III of England. The dramatic collapse of Edward II's rule became one of the most famous political crises in medieval English history. But it also highlights something fascinating about royal life. The personal relationships of rulers could have consequences that extended far beyond palace walls. A friendship. A rivalry. A moment of loyalty. Or a decision made out of emotion rather than strategy. All of these could shift alliances and ignite conflicts that affected entire nations. And while some royal courts were filled with tension and rivalry, others developed reputations for intellectual curiosity and cultural brilliance. One such ruler was Frederick II. Frederick ruled during the 13th century and was often described by contemporaries as one of the most unusual monarchs of the Middle Ages. He spoke multiple languages, studied science and philosophy, and maintained a court that welcomed scholars from many different cultures. In an age when many rulers focused primarily on warfare, Frederick showed deep interest in learning. He sponsored scientific experiments, encouraged translations of ancient texts, and even wrote a famous book about falconry called De Arte Venandi cum Avibus. Visitors to his court often remarked on how different it felt from other royal courts. Instead of endless feasting and political maneuvering, conversations sometimes focused on astronomy, medicine, poetry, and philosophy. Frederick's curiosity made him admired by some scholars, but also distrusted by certain religious authorities who believed his ideas challenged traditional beliefs. Once again, we see the strange duality of royal life. A ruler could be praised as brilliant by some observers while criticized or feared by others. Power magnified every action, every decision, every friendship, every eccentric interest. And so, as the castle grows quieter and the candles burn lower, the stories of kings continue to reveal something deeper than simple tales of power. They show how human nature operates under extraordinary circumstances. How ambition mixes with insecurity. How loyalty collides with political reality. And how the private lives of a few individuals could shape the destinies of millions. The night is still long. Many corridors of history remain unexplored. The castle is quieter now. Only a few candles remain burning along the stone corridors, and the guards on the outer walls shift their weight as the cold night air drifts across the battlements. In the royal chambers, thick curtains block the wind, and the world outside feels distant. Yet even in these calm hours, the lives of kings were rarely peaceful. Royal courts were places where loyalty, ambition, jealousy, and opportunity constantly collided. And sometimes, the personalities of rulers themselves shaped the atmosphere of the entire kingdom. One ruler whose personal life fascinated observers across Europe was Henry VIII. Henry's reign became famous not only for major political changes but also for the dramatic events surrounding his marriages. In the early 16th century, England was still part of the wider Catholic world, with religious authority centered in Rome. But Henry's desire to change his marriage eventually led to one of the most important religious shifts in English history. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been married to him for many years. However, Henry became convinced that their marriage would not produce the male heir he desperately wanted. When he sought permission from the Pope to annul the marriage and was refused, the conflict eventually helped trigger the English Reformation. Henry declared himself the head of the Church of England, allowing him to marry again. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, quickly became one of the most talked about figures in Europe. Anne was intelligent, ambitious, and deeply involved in court politics. But her rise was followed by a dramatic fall. Accused of serious crimes by political enemies, she was arrested and eventually executed. Later marriages followed, including the young Queen Catherine Howard, whose life at court also ended tragically after accusations of misconduct. The dramatic pattern of Henry's marriages made his personal life a constant subject of gossip and discussion throughout Europe. Foreign ambassadors sent detailed reports back to their governments describing the latest developments inside the English court. Royal marriage, after all, was never simply a private matter. It affected alliances, inheritance, and the stability of the entire kingdom. Henry VIII's reign shows how deeply personal desires could influence national history. A king's wish for an heir helped reshape the religious structure of an entire country. And while Henry's story became famous for its drama, other monarchs became known for something quite different: their extreme caution and secrecy. One example is Philip II of Spain. Philip ruled one of the largest empires in the world at the time. His territories stretched across Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia. Yet despite this immense power, Philip lived a surprisingly quiet and disciplined life. Unlike many rulers who loved elaborate celebrations, Philip preferred long hours of paperwork and careful planning. He spent countless evenings reading reports, writing letters, and studying maps that described events happening across his far-reaching empire. Visitors to his palace at El Escorial often remarked on its austere atmosphere. The building itself looked more like a fortress and monastery combined than a luxurious palace. Philip believed that a ruler should show seriousness and devotion rather than excessive extravagance. His personal habits reflected that belief. Where other courts were filled with music, laughter, and elaborate banquets, Philip's court often felt quiet and disciplined. This contrast highlights something fascinating about royal history. Different rulers expressed power in very different ways. Some preferred spectacle and celebration. Others preferred strict control and careful planning. But all of them understood that their behavior would influence how their subjects viewed the monarchy. Because kings were not just political leaders. They were symbols. Their lives were watched, discussed, praised, and criticized across entire continents. And every decision, whether about war, marriage, friendship, or religion, could ripple outward into the wider world. As the final hours of the night approach, the castle settles into deeper silence. Servants extinguish lamps. The corridors empty. And somewhere behind heavy wooden doors, the rulers whose stories we have followed through these long hours finally rest. Yet history itself never truly sleeps. Across centuries and kingdoms, the lives of kings continue to echo through chronicles, letters, paintings, and legends. Their triumphs and mistakes remain part of the long human story. The final hours of the night are approaching. The castle is nearly silent now. Only the occasional crackle of a dying torch or the distant shuffle of a guard's boots breaks the stillness. These quiet hours are often when historians like to imagine the private thoughts of rulers, moments when kings and queens were no longer surrounded by advisors, nobles, or court politics. Just people alone with their decisions. Because ruling a kingdom meant carrying an enormous weight of responsibility. And sometimes, that pressure revealed very unusual sides of a ruler's personality. One fascinating example comes from the court of Peter III of Russia. Peter III had spent much of his childhood in German courts before becoming the ruler of Russia. When he finally gained the throne, many nobles expected him to rule with confidence and strength. Instead, his behavior often confused and frustrated the Russian aristocracy. Peter had a deep fascination with toy soldiers and miniature military displays. Long after he became emperor, he reportedly spent hours arranging tiny armies on tables, reenacting battles with great enthusiasm. For some courtiers, this seemed childish. For others, it was simply another example of how different royal personalities could be from the expectations placed upon them. His marriage to Catherine the Great also became one of the most dramatic relationships in royal history. Catherine was intelligent, politically skilled, and far more popular with many Russian nobles than her husband. Their marriage was filled with tension. Within just a few months of Peter becoming emperor, a group of powerful supporters organized a coup that placed Catherine on the throne. Peter III was forced to abdicate, and Catherine went on to become one of the most famous rulers in Russian history. Her reign saw major cultural and political developments, and she worked to strengthen Russia's influence across Europe. Yet her rise to power also reminds us how fragile royal authority could be. Even a crowned emperor could lose everything if powerful figures at court decided to support someone else. Another monarch whose personal life attracted enormous curiosity was Louis XV. Louis inherited the French throne as a child and was initially loved by his people. Early in his reign, he was known as Louis the Beloved. But as the years passed, public opinion changed. One reason was the king's increasingly private lifestyle inside the Palace of Versailles. Versailles was already one of the most magnificent royal residences in Europe, filled with vast gardens, glittering halls, and endless ceremonial rooms. Yet within this enormous palace, Louis developed a hidden world of private apartments where only a small group of trusted companions were allowed. One of the most influential figures at court was Madame de Pompadour. Madame de Pompadour was not a queen, but she became one of the most powerful women in France. She supported artists, architects, and writers, helping shape French culture during the 18th century. Her patronage contributed to the popularity of elegant artistic styles such as Rococo. Despite her influence in cultural life, critics at court often complained about the growing power of royal favorites. Some believed these close companions had too much influence over the king's decisions. Again and again throughout history, we see the same pattern. A ruler's personal relationships could shape politics, art, diplomacy, and even the public reputation of the monarchy itself. And as the centuries passed, the fascination with royal lives only grew stronger. Chroniclers wrote about them. Artists painted them. Writers turned them into legends. Because people have always been curious about what happens behind palace doors. The crown represents authority. But the person wearing it remains human. With ambitions, fears, friendships, and flaws. And sometimes those private emotions, hidden from the public eye, become the most powerful forces shaping history. The night is nearly over now. Soon the first light of morning will appear beyond the castle walls. Servants will return to the corridors, courtiers will gather in audience halls, and another day of royal life will begin. But the stories we've walked through tonight remain part of the long and complicated history of kings. Stories of power and personality. Of loyalty and betrayal. Of ambition, curiosity, and sometimes very strange human behavior. Because history is never only about crowns and battles. It is also about the deeply human lives lived behind them. The first pale hint of dawn is beginning to touch the horizon now. Inside the castle, the darkness that filled the corridors through the long night slowly starts to fade. Servants begin to stir from their small quarters, kitchens warm with the first fires of the morning, and guards on the towers watch the sky change from black to deep blue. But before the day fully arrives, there are still a few more stories from the strange and complicated world of kings. Because history shows us again and again that royal power did not make rulers immune to human weaknesses. In fact, the enormous authority of kings often magnified their personalities, whether those personalities were wise, eccentric, disciplined, or impulsive. One particularly unusual monarch was Christian VII of Denmark. Christian became king as a teenager, but his reign quickly became known for its instability. Historical records suggest that he struggled with serious mental health difficulties, which made it challenging for him to manage the responsibilities of ruling a kingdom. Inside the Danish court, real political influence gradually shifted toward advisors. One of the most important figures was Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee originally arrived as the king's physician. But his intelligence and confidence allowed him to gain enormous influence over royal decisions. During the early 1770s, Struensee introduced sweeping reforms across Denmark. He abolished certain forms of censorship, reduced torture in legal systems, and attempted to modernize many parts of government. For a brief moment, Denmark experienced one of the most rapid reform movements in Europe. But the situation inside the royal palace grew increasingly complicated. Struensee's close relationship with the young queen, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, became the subject of intense gossip and political rivalry. Enemies at court eventually organized a coup. Struensee was arrested, tried for treason, and executed. Queen Caroline Matilda was exiled, and the royal court returned to a more traditional form of government. The entire episode shows how quickly power could shift inside royal courts. A single advisor might dominate political decisions for a short time, only to fall dramatically when rival factions gained the upper hand. Another ruler whose private habits fascinated observers was James I of England. James became King of England in 1603 after the death of Elizabeth I, uniting the English and Scottish crowns under one monarch. James was deeply interested in scholarship. He wrote books about politics, kingship, and even the dangers of witchcraft. One of the most famous projects associated with his reign was the creation of the King James Bible, which became one of the most influential texts in the English-speaking world. Yet while James enjoyed intellectual discussions and religious debates, his personal friendships at court sometimes caused political controversy. Several young nobles gained great influence through their closeness to the king, including George Villiers. Villiers rose rapidly through the ranks of the court, eventually becoming one of the most powerful men in England. Like many royal favorites before him, his rise created jealousy and resentment among other nobles. But James valued loyalty and companionship deeply, and he trusted Villiers more than many traditional advisors. Again we see the recurring theme of royal history. Kings were not simply political machines. They were individuals who formed friendships, made emotional decisions, and sometimes trusted people whom others considered dangerous. Those personal choices often had consequences that extended far beyond the palace. And as the first golden light of morning finally reaches the castle walls, our long journey through the private lives of rulers comes to a gentle pause. Throughout the night we've walked through centuries of history, from medieval towers to grand palaces, from whispered court scandals to sweeping political reforms. We've seen how the private lives of kings could shape wars, religions, and entire nations. But perhaps the most surprising lesson is this. Behind every crown was simply a human being. A person navigating power, relationships, expectations, and emotions in a world where every action was watched and remembered. The banners on the castle towers now glow in the sunlight. The kingdom awakens. And history continues its endless story, one ruler, one decision, and one quiet moment at a time.